Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Shalom Desai, and I'm the Vice President of Advancement at the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. In a year where the challenges of the pandemic seem to be both dwindling and lingering, I feel fortunate to connect with ATC's constituents via our ongoing series of virtual programs like this one. Tonight's virtual program, titled Rescuing the Planet, was inspired by a remarkable book called Rescuing the Planet, funnily enough, written by one of our guests tonight, Tony Hiss. A few weeks ago, I was deeply engrossed in Tony's book. As I read chapter after chapter, I started to take notes in the margin. About halfway through, right before Tony started delving into Benton MacKaye's vision for the Appalachian Trail, I realized something. My notes in the margin read like a doomsday list. And here are some examples: ecological devastation, species extinction, carbon bombs. What became clear in reading those penciled in notes is that the title of Tony's book is anything but alarmist. It's a call to action. It's an urgent call to action. What we call the impacts of climate change today are merely glimpses to the scale of devastation which may occur in the future if we don't take urgent action now. As Tony, and as many of those who have been deeply engaged in the conversation and work around climate change and land conservation will tell you, we must act now. This sense of urgency underscores much of the work that we've done here at the Appalachian Trail Conservancy and the work that we plan to do in the future. As we prepare to celebrate 200-year anniversaries, Benton MacKaye's vision in 2021 and the anniversary of the Conservancy in 2025, we challenge ourselves to think bigger, of not only the footpath, but the landscape and its ecology beyond. This is a cornerstone of our current strategic plan, and more importantly, it's the bedrock of the work we will undertake in the next century of AT management and protection. As Benton MacKaye urged us so long ago, we are not just stewarding a trail, but an entire realm that contains the sources of life: the air, the water, the land, the species, and the human communities who call this realm their home. This is what we're setting to discuss today, and what the ATC is setting out to do in its next century to fulfill completely Benton MacKaye's original vision from 1921. To learn why this is a priority, not just for the ATC, but for all who care for the Earth, let's turn to our guests. Today, I am honored and extremely grateful to introduce Tony Hiss himself, as well as John Griffin of the Chesapeake Conservation Partnership. As we unearth the topics in Tony's book and discuss conservation of the AT landscape, I urge you to do two things. First and foremost, pick up a copy of Tony's book, and subsequently, consider your role in the work to be done to rescue the planet. I also urge you to remember your last journey on the AT. Think of the connection you made to the ecosystem around you as you walked along. That journey was an opportunity to learn, to appreciate, and act for a more sustainable future. Just like Benton said all those years ago, the trail was meant there to study nature. That's what trails are built for, fundamentally, to connect people to nature. And today, our guests will help reveal how that relationship can help us work together to rescue the planet. Tony and John, would you mind taking turns introducing yourself before we kick off the discussion? John, would you mind going first?
Sure, not at all, Sean. Hi, everybody. I'm honored to be here. John Griffin. I have been for the last 4+ years the program manager of the Chesapeake Conservation Partnership, which was established 12 years ago as a large landscape collaborative, federal, state agencies, local agencies, and many, many land trusts. The ATC is a member because, of course, the trail goes through our geography in portions of Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. Real quickly, before I assumed this position, I was very fortunate to have spent most of my career in Maryland state government. I was the deputy secretary of the Department of Natural Resources. I was the secretary twice under different governors. And as a young guy, I was the environmental staffer for a governor way back when. And then as I ended my career, I was the chief of staff for a former governor, career in state government. I also was the general manager of the Washington Suburban Sanitary Commission, which is one of the 10 largest such utilities in the United States. So again, I've been very fortunate to have had a career, most of which was centered around the Department of Natural Resources and all the good work it does. I might, if I could, just offer a personal observation. I'm also grateful to the ATC and one of its former members, I think the advisory committee, Jonathan Doherty, Jonathan asked me to fill in a few years ago when he was out of town for a meeting of the ATC. And it was there that I noticed a long lost friend and guy that I admire greatly, Tony Hiss, who was there starting to do research on the trail, obviously for his outstanding book. And Tony and I first met in the late 80s, early 90s when he was in Maryland researching and talking to a lot of us about initiatives we were undertaking then that ended up being part of his iconic article in the New Yorker called The Sense of Place. So thank you for that. And Tony, all yours.
Well, thank you, Sheldon, for giving John and me a chance to get together again. It's always a treat. And it's such a thrill to be here with everyone tonight. I'm a writer mostly. Grew up in New York City on the edge of the Appalachians, largely in the apartment you see behind me, our old stomping grounds. I was a staff writer at the New Yorker magazine for about 30 years. After that, I was a visiting scholar at New York University for another 25 years. I've written 15 books so far. Our talk tonight comes out of my most recent book, Rescuing the Planet, which this one only took me about 10 years to write, John, so I'm catching up to myself. And I thought it might be useful just to start by showing a few pictures, and maybe Jordan can throw that on the screen. And Jordan, when I need a new slide, do I just say next, please? In the old-fashioned way? Good. Next, please. This book is about it's a very hopeful book, as Shalin was saying, but it's about a horrendous subject, the so-called mass extinctions crisis or emergency, sometimes referred to as the other environmental crisis, meaning the one other than climate change, although of course they're intimately intertwined. 1 million species of plants and animals are at imminent risk of extinction over the next few decades. This was the last northern male white rhino, Sudan, who died just a few years ago, with his devoted keeper by his side, who had come in that morning for one last scratch behind the ear. Next, please. We've had to coin a horrifying new word, an endling, meaning the very last of its species. This was Lonesome George, the last Pinta Island tortoise in the Galapagos, who died a few years ago himself at the age of 101. Next, please. One of the ways we got into trouble in this country was by thinking that if we did something different, it meant we had to do something totally different and not remember or pay any heed to what had been happening before. Just around the time we first began protecting land with Yellowstone National Park, this was one of the most famous paintings in the country in the late 19th century, endlessly reproduced. It's called American Progress. Progress is that young lady with the golden hair, not very many clothes on. She's white, the garments are white. She's floating across the continent from east to west, from right to left, bringing with her telegraph wires, stagecoaches, covered wagons, trains, and light. Ahead of her is darkness, and retreating before her are the Native Americans, the buffalo, and a snarling bear, all of them about to be replaced by farmers and urbanites. We fell into this either-or trap early on. And next, please. It's fortunate that people like Benton MacKaye began to appear just after this period. Someone who could think at a different scale, at a scale that began to recognize basic human needs, and, as we now know, equally the needs of plants and animals. MacKaye, at the age of 21, just graduating from college, bushwhacked his way up Stratton Mountain in the Green Mountains of Vermont, no trails in those days, shinnied up the tallest tree he could find, swayed there, and looking out, was overcome by what he later called a planetary feeling, a day that remained with him for the rest of his life. In his old age, he said, as he swung there, he felt himself to be part of a single landscape along the ridgeline of the Appalachian Mountains. And then immediately, I'm betraying my northern bias. I was brought up to say Appalachian and not Appalachian. A single landscape that stretched from Maine to Georgia across 14 states. And even then, he began to think someday perhaps there could be a trail connecting all of those peaks. Although it wasn't until 21 years later that he wrote his article that galvanized everyone into beginning to create the Appalachian Trail. Next, please. It's a good thing that he began thinking at that scale when he did, because we've discovered that our ideas about how to protect animals and plants have been way out of date for a long time. It's fine to create national parks like Yellowstone, Yosemite, and all the others, but they don't do much to retain their animal and plant populations because they have their own ideas about their own needs and what their own boundaries are. Next, please. And gradually this has been accumulating as the science of what's now called half-Earth, the idea that we need to protect at least half of a plant and an animal's original habitat in order for it to thrive. Sometimes called nature needs half, sometimes called half-Earth. There are a wealth of studies showing this, and also thanks to E.O. Wilson, the great Harvard biologist and conservationist and spokesperson globally for biodiversity, we can make predictive math, and we can show that if we retain only about 15% of the planet as protected land, the figure we finally reached after 150 years after Yellowstone, we can really hope to hang on to only about 25% or less of the plants and animals with which we share the planet. But if we bump that up to 50%, there's a good chance we could save 85 to 90%. Not everything, but almost everything. And what makes my book hopeful is I encountered so many people as I wandered around the country who are doing so much and so successfully that I think we have a good chance to lick this one. We can stave off that extinction crisis. Next, please. One of the people who's changed our way of thinking was this fierce-looking Russian biologist named Vladimir Ivanovich Vernadsky, who in the 1920s wrote the first definitive book about the biosphere. He showed it was enormously expansive from side to side, as we've all known, thinking of the wealth and abundance of this world, but it had this other dimension, its height, or rather its thinness, that almost every creature, every species we know about lives in this narrow band between the bottom of the ocean and the top of the Himalayas. That's only 12.5 miles. And if it were laid out horizontally, it's the kind of distance that we could hope to traverse on a decent road in 20 minutes. So we have this built-in contradiction, something that's enormous and abundant and something that's by its very nature precarious. Next, please. Here are the 4 largest landscapes in our continent of North America, all of them extraordinary places and all of them where wonderful things are happening. We're blessed in this continent by having these 2 flanking mountain chains which help us keep our geography in our own minds. MacKaye's Appalachians and everyone else's Appalachians on the right-hand side of the screen, going from top to bottom, north to south, paralleled by the Rocky Mountains in the west, which now have their own Benton MacKaye, a late 20th century discovery of a young Canadian activist and lawyer, Harvey Locke, who realized that the landscape north of Yellowstone, reaching all the way up to the top of the Yukon, was a single place. which he called Yellowstone to Yukon, and set up an extraordinary group of partners, Y2Y, which has since then been able to protect about 22% of that enormous landscape. Then across the top of the continent is the boreal forest of Canada and Alaska. Almost impossible, or at least for a city kid like me, to stretch his mind around it. A place that's 3,700 miles long, 1,000 miles from top to bottom. But hugely important things are happening there too, because the Canadian government, having not treated its own native populations well, the First Nations, is finally turning to them for help and going to create up a whole new set of national parks called Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas, where the indigenous populations will be the rangers of the parks, the mucklucks on the ground, they say, and that will protect what is now the world's most intact and largest wildness, something still 85% intact, more intact than the Amazon or the Russian taiga. But to my mind, to my way of thinking, for my money, the most important landscape to keep an eye on is the Appalachians, because here I think we have a chance to do something truly extraordinary, because this is a landscape that's inhabited by and surrounded by well over 100 million people, and they're immensely diverse population. MacKaye wanted a place set aside for human restoration and recreation. We now know it's of equal importance to the future of plants and animals. So here's the real challenge. How can a place this size, surrounded by this many people, this many diverse people, make a go of it? Well, I think we have a wonderful chance to do it, and I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about that. Next, please, Jordan. Yes, happy birthday to the AT. 100 years since MacKaye published his article, which he called An Exercise in Regional Planning. But also, happy 87th birthday, or not quite so happy 87th birthday, because it was in 1935, next please, that the great split came, the great schism in the early Appalachian Trail thinking between Benton MacKaye and Myron Avery, who took charge of building the trail. Myron Avery thought this talk of a larger landscape was premature. He was a hard-headed, practical man. He got the trail built. It's sometimes said he left 2 trails behind him, the Appalachian Trail and a trail of bruised egos from Maine to Georgia, but he did get it built. It's because of that that we have the trail corridor and its protected state today. So there's a lot to be said for Myron Avery as well as for Benton MacKaye. Next, please. Benton MacKaye did say, and I'll try not to quote scripture too many times, high and dry above the stupendous detail of our job, we should hold the reason for it all. This is not to cut a path and then say, ain't it beautiful? Our job is to open a realm. Some people, I'm told, don't like the word realm anymore. They find it fanciful or somehow highfalutin. But we need a word that represents something at a scale that's above a region or even a landscape. Next, please. So I'm going to throw out a whole lot of ideas of things I think are beginning to happen and need to happen much more rapidly than before, because not only is half Earth becoming a necessity, but a first step towards half Earth is becoming an even more urgent necessity, and that's to protect something like 30% of the land and water by the year 2030. And that's a goal that the new administration has embraced as a national conservation goal for the US. It's something 60 countries have already embraced, calling themselves the High Ambition Coalition. And in October of this year, 196 countries all over the world are going to meet in China and embrace this idea of 30 by 30 as at least an interim step towards 50 by 50. However, if anything I say sounds too ridiculous, too outrageous, please remember our safe word here is the practical Myron Avery. And just if I say something that you find way beyond the pale, say to yourself, Myron Avery, and we'll skip ahead to the next slide, please. Next, please. I think the one big mistake MacKaye and Avery made was not being able to forgive each other for having different thoughts. They needed one another. They still need one another because there's so much of the Myronic work that needs to be done as well as the Bentonic work that needs doing. Historically, there have been sort of two camps of people, one interested in access, the other saying we got to protect places because unless we protect places worth gaining access to, what good is access? So the idea of the big tent has to get a whole lot bigger to do right by people and nature. And I got rid of in this slide the two images that my wife said were the most corny. So on to the next, please. Okay, in terms of trail activity, the Appalachian Trail has inspired an enormous family of great trails in the East. And it's time for them all to at least convene regularly and think of themselves as a family. And also no more loose ends, please. No more trails petering out. Look at the North Country National Scenic Trail stopping short of the Appalachian Trail. Look at the Appalachian Trail itself stopping short of other trails. Look at the Great Eastern Trail to the west of the Appalachian Trail coming into being by cobbling together various existing trail sediments. It's time to embrace the International Appalachian Trail to the north of the AT and the north of Katahdin in Maine. An idea that occurred to a guy in Maine one day. He was so excited, he stopped into a filling station and began telling the guy filling his car all about this exciting idea just had, and the guy didn't know what the heck he was talking about. And then connecting it down to the south also, there's the East Coast Greenway coming into being a hiking, biking, and walking trail along the urban corridor on the East Coast. All right, we've got all of these great tall trails coming up. Now we have to connect them with ladder trails from east to west. Everything needs to be bound together as one trail system, what MacKaye used to call a braided network of trails. Next, please. Okay, and MacKaye was interested in urban trail systems too. He had a hand in the so-called Bay Circuit of trails and landscapes circling Boston in the 1920s, something that's coming into being now, mostly as a trail system, but still needs work as a landscape system, and also needs to be connected to the rest of the landscape and trail systems. Every trail needs a proper terminus. It's wonderful that the Long Path, another long distance trail from New York City all the way up to the Adirondacks, has been brought into town, into New York. Every trail needs a proper terminus, but the 175th Street subway station, its current terminus, is not a place that inspires anyone to begin a trek to the Adirondacks. That needs further thought. Next, please. Oh, and it's time to Bayerize. That's my word. Paul Beyer, great conservation biologist in the West, has shown that the 1,000-foot wide right-of-way trail, protected corridor trail of the Appalachian Trail is wide enough to let people pass through. But if you want to let animals pass and plants pass through, you need a trail at least 1.25 miles wide. We've got to start Bayerizing all of our trails to make that possible. Next, please. Oh, and then there's the people who the amazing geography of the continent have not served well. The African-American population of the eastern US is clustered around the edges of the Appalachians, but separated from the Appalachian trails. That's seen on the left. At the same time, some of the poorest people in the country live up in the Appalachians itself, and they've been neglected for far too long. We've got to start bringing, if we talk about involving people, we've got to start bringing all of these immensely diverse populations together and focused on the same process and project. Next, please. As for the landscape, there's a group called the Wildlands Network, which thinks that the Wild East consists of over half of the land east of the Mississippi River, cores and corridors. And then there's the extraordinary scientific work that Mark Anderson's been doing with his hundreds of colleagues to show that not only is there extraordinary biodiversity along the Appalachians and in that corridor, but it's biodiversity that's already on the move thanks to global warming. You've got huge biodiversity in the south. You've got the potential for a huge receiving area up in the north. All of this has to be coordinated. Next, please. Here's one of those receiving areas up in Maine, the High Peaks area. They've already protected about 50,000 acres out of a potential 200,000 acres that could be a place that 50 years from now we would want to establish as a national wildlife refuge of some kind. But this is an interesting landscape because so many people see it so differently. It's got some ski resorts now. It's got some Native American lands owned by the Penobscot Indians, but it also is a place where the Navy, during the Cold War, set up its SEER school, its Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape School, thinking of it as a remote and unfriendly landscape where Navy pilots who had been downed could be trained how to escape their captors, North Koreans or whoever they were. And the Chinese figures at the left, there's a knife cutting through barbed wire, and the Chinese figures at the left say, "Here be tigers," a reference back to early maps. "Here be dragons," of territory that was unknown and also to be territory to be afraid of. So all of these things are working all at the same time. Next, please. Then we've got to reach out to other large landscape projects like John's Chesapeake Bay Partnership, which has itself taken the goal of protecting 25% of that enormous area by the year 2025, leading to 30 by 30 and probably 50 by 50. And I think they're, if I'm right, John, up to 22% already. Then you've got this project of connecting across the international border of Canada and the US, the Adirondacks and the Algonquins Park in Ontario. A route that was blazed by a moose named Alice to prove that there was a connection. It wasn't just a fanciful idea. And then you've got the Two Countries, One Forest initiative, which thinks of itself as a little Y2Y up in the Northeast, connecting Maine and the Adirondacks to Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. Next, please. And then there's this 200-year-old farmland in the Lehigh Valley within the Appalachians that just this year is being overwhelmed by new warehouse construction. In some ways, a COVID-related development because people needed, when they were quarantined, to have things delivered within a day. So these warehouses are taking over extraordinary farmland of great value, but we have no mechanism for protecting extraordinary farmland of great value. Unless, next please. Jordan, if we could just, unless we go back to an earlier idea, which was something called the Green Line Park idea, pioneered in the Adirondacks, that you could have places that were beloved by people and that they would protect, but that don't have to be owned entirely by public entities. It can be shared as public-private partnerships. And this was going to have been the great environmental initiative and legacy of the second Jimmy Carter administration, except there never was a second Jimmy Carter administration. He got whomped by Ronald Reagan in 1980. Now it's time for it to come back, and it's already beginning to come back in the Delmarva Peninsula, where John and I are both working on something called the Delmarva Oasis, an idea down there to protect 50% of that tri-state landscape, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, by the year 2030. Next, please. And we're stuck with having to think about this farmland because it was MacKaye himself who said that the reason he could think at a planetary have a planetary scale was because he had been involved with three what he called elemental environments: the primeval, the wild, the rural, farms and villages, and the urban. And in his kind of math, 1 + 1 + 1 = 4. That was what swept over him when he was swinging from that treetop. A perspective that lets us, as he said, operate and think and cooperate at a bigger scale. He even called it the next step in human development and the gradually awakened common mind. So maybe, next please. You'll forgive me if I suggest and won't think it's entirely graffiti that the AT begin to think of itself as the ATR, the Appalachian Trail and Realm Conservancy. Next, please. This is the final one. Just wanted to say thank you so much. And I understand books are available, and I've sent up a whole slew of COVID-19 social distancing signed book plates that can be fixed into the books. And now I'll say, let's start the conversation with John and Shalom, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Tony. Yeah, and I think a lot of our audience has actually read the book already, which is great because we were able to source some pretty excellent questions that are going to be the basis of our conversation tonight. So I want to dive right into it and start with this idea of the bentonic and the myronic, which I think is the first time I've ever heard them used in adjective form. But I think one of the things that you reference in your book is a quote by Benton MacKaye, and it's a really interesting quote. He states, "The trails can help the areas and the areas can help the trails." And I think that many folks think of those two things as distinct entities that are kind of in silos in their thinking. So what roles do trails like the AT, for example, play in retaining, restoring, and reconnecting wildness?
Well, they bring people out into the wildness. So they're hugely important. That quote that you just read is interesting because it is something MacKaye was trying to peddle in his 80s. He thought that the Pacific Crest Trail in the West and the Continental Divide Trail, which hadn't quite yet come into being, could be the anchors for a whole series of connected, protected areas in the West, and they could feed each other. We say that two communities have often been in two different silos. Well, it's more than just mixing together the resources and the nurturing qualities that can get contained in silos, because something much more combustible happens when you mix them together, something that really brings these two entities together and allows them to work at much greater speed and in harmony with each other. Maybe John has other ideas.
Yeah, and John, I think this is a good time to turn to you because I think you're doing the work. And, you know, one of the things that I understood in reading Tony's book is that at heart, it's about the intersection of two systems. It's human systems and natural systems. And your work is fascinating precisely because it falls at the intersection of those two systems. So as somebody who's experienced in this work, how have you and perhaps the Chesapeake Conservation Partnership that you work for helped people imagine themselves in this position of preserving the natural systems that they impact and in turn are impacted by?
Thank you for that question. What comes to mind initially is a quote that I read some time ago by a Native American elder to the effect that the way we treat the earth is reflected in how we treat its people, and the way we treat its people is reflected in how we treat the earth. So, which very much symbolizes the interconnectedness between the natural world and the human world, natural systems, human systems. I personally believe that human systems are part of the larger natural world, and so they're two sides of the same coin, but in a way they're not, because I think nature can persist without human beings, but the reverse is not true. And so that's just a starting off point, because you need to have some sort of value judgment about all this, it seems to me. And then more recently, we've been seeing growing studies of the relationships between for human beings spending time in green outdoor spaces and their public health. And of course, we have seen, particularly with the pandemic, both sides of that coin. people that have access to green spaces have been coming out in droves during the pandemic to escape from their homes or businesses and spend time in nature. But the flip side is also true. You see a lot of disinvested communities of color and poor white communities of color who don't have access or the means to get to all the green spaces. So I think we need to think about going forward how to create smaller natural areas in urban settings and rural settings that are accessible to people who need to spend time in nature for their own public health. So I think, historically, when I got into this field, there was a general apprehension about a lot of the areas that we would conserve being impacted by human activity there. And certainly there's areas that we want to preserve with little or no, because of their ecological value, human activity, but there's so many others where we can guide human activity so that they can start to not only learn about it, but also benefit from it. So to me, in my career, whenever there's been an issue, environmental or whatever, of affecting people's individual health, the connections there are immediate and lasting. And this is an obvious situation we're in now. I think it's much more easy to start to connect people to the reality that they need the natural world for their own existence.
And what
I don't know.
Well, I guess what have you done at the partnership? Because the partnership is thinking about this at a larger scale. So in terms of its ability to kind of think about the intersection of these two systems, how do you see the work of the partnership that you're involved in advancing this idea of these two systems kind of working in mutual sustainability?
Oh, I think there's a number of, well, first of all, the partnership is primarily land trusts and other nonprofits who work more at the community level and have the pulse of the people, the residents there in terms of their desires. They interact with them, which is why I've always liked land trusts and supported their development over the years. So I think that there's a mix of partners there. Each one may focus more on preservation of agricultural lands, more on forests, natural heritage sites, biodiversity, et cetera. But I think there's a growing recognition of all the partners that we've got to find ways to, in almost every respect, connect people to those systems which we're conserving and preserving. So it's kind of an ongoing but growing, I would say, in the Chesapeake Conservation Partnership recognition. Last fall, in lieu of a big annual conference in person, we did series of 4 or 5 virtual sessions on the topic of public health, equity, and green space, which were very well attended. So we're trying to shift the conservation focus somewhat to really thinking about these communities that don't have green space, don't have easy access to it, because their public health is being affected by that and many other obvious environmental harms. But we're in the land conservation business, so we need to do our part. I don't know if that helps or not answer your question.
Yeah, it makes me think about the Appalachian Trail Landscape Partnership and how all of the partnerships that are involved in this work and all the individual organizations involved in this work have some pretty daunting numbers ahead of them. So I'm gonna go back to the numbers that Tony presented, because in his book, he said that there's another scale that matters, which is the scale in our heads. And one of the things that kind of blew my mind was this idea that America is currently less than 15% protected. And you're urging that we achieve 50% protection by 2050. That's a big lift.
Yes,
so that's going to require us, and correct me if my math is wrong here, I was not good at math in high school or ever. But I think that means that we have to work 12 times faster in terms of protection than we're working right now. So if we have to work 12 times faster, that is a big ask, and that is at times very difficult to wrap your mind around. So in the spirit of this being a big, hairy, audacious goal, which is what you call it, is it even possible? And if it is possible, why? And if it's not possible, then why are we urging towards this goal?
Tony, I think you want to start.
Well, I think it is possible just because so many people are already sprinting toward that goal and doing so much extraordinary work. Was what I had the good fortune to chronicle as I moved around the continent, both here in the Appalachians and across the face of the continent. Well, there's some slack. Fortunately, the boreal forest work by the indigenous nations up there takes off as it seems to be taking off, that will pick up a big percentage of what we need to get to, which gives us a little bit of breathing room, but not much. As you say, we're all under the gun about this. But the other thing that makes it possible, I think, is people taking hope, but also looking around and seeing what could be done differently. How could I get involved? The two questions I get most often are, why 50%? And then how do I get involved? I don't think anyone in this audience tonight has asked that question years ago and has already gotten amazingly involved. But there's a new bill that just got introduced in Congress called Transit to Trails. This is a wonderful idea, bringing people in underserved communities out into the landscape. No one ever thought of that as a piece of legislation before. When we get together and put our minds to it, all kinds of new possibilities seem to spring up as these partnerships evolve. And that's why the Appalachians, I think, have this head start, because this is the one large landscape in North America that has the most diverse population. Extraordinary strengths once we begin to think of it as an extraordinary strength and not just as a problem.
Good point.
Absolutely. Yeah. And speaking of populations, one of the things that I keep in mind is that we're not just talking about human populations, we're talking about species across the board. And one of the kind of consistent themes throughout your book is that focusing on conserving large landscapes is meant to keep ecosystems intact and promote biodiversity and evolution. And we kind of touched upon those topics earlier, but why are biodiversity and evolution in particular key to living with and surviving climate change? And Tony and John, either one of you, I know that you're both.
Well, I mean, that in a way is a different discussion, just because we know that everything out there that isn't us is something we need for us to still be here. We wouldn't have clean water, we wouldn't have clean air, we wouldn't have soil, we wouldn't have things growing that we can use if it weren't for these plants and animals that got here long before we did, and are our extraordinary companions. So there's all kinds of data showing how we can't get along without them. But it's also our embrace of them is, as John was saying, changes our brains and minds. And I think people, if they see a damaged place, feel that damage within them and feel stronger when that damage is being repaired, especially if they're doing it themselves. So yes, the two crises, the two emergencies are inextricably intertwined, but it's just as important as keeping all these plants and animals alive as is keeping humans clothed and fed.
Yeah, I can bring it down to the Chesapeake Bay watershed and the partnership. We're, in order to achieve 30% of conservation of valuable lands, including those habitat areas that preserve and protect and help restore species, thinking of the predicted sixth extinction. As Tony mentioned earlier, we're at about, as of early 2018, we measure now every 2 years, doing accounting of acquisitions of various types. We were about 9.2 million acres, which is about 22% of the 41,000 acres in the watershed. And to get to 30% by 2030, we need about another 3+ million. Now, this summer, we're going to do the biannual updating accounting, and I think that's going to jump the 22% up fairly well. And if any of the proposals for funding that come through President Biden's proposals in Congress, that's going to really jump up the amount of funding for, state and local governments and private land trusts, et cetera. So I don't. At our annual meeting back in 2016, one of the co-chairs of the partnership threw out this challenge of BHAG, Build Hurry Audacious goal of achieving actually 50 by 50. And so it took a couple of years to get some of the partners kind of settled in on that, a lot of discussions, a lot of science sharing, but gradually everybody came around. And at the same time, we've had this production of more and more science studies verifying the need to do that. And we did 20% by 2030, as Tony alluded to, as kind of an interim step. See if we can get to that. That will build momentum if we make it. That will help us carry forward. Because to conserve 50% of viable lands in the watershed, that's about an additional 8 million plus acres. So that seems very daunting if you add those two numbers together from where we are now. But if you break it up into chunks, it can build on itself, and the momentum can build on itself, I think. So,
many years ago, President Roosevelt, FDR, helped start the March of Dimes as a way of eradicating polio. School kids would collect dimes. The point here is that little things add up too. There's this whole concept which started in Seattle, Washington, of pollinator pathways. You can plant a street, an urban street, with a series of street tree plantings on the ground that attract pollinating insects, bees and butterflies. The Cleveland Museum, I've learned some of this just because I've had to give some talks to various places. The Cleveland Museum of Natural History has finally decided that natural history involves what exists now, not just dinosaur bones. And they've started a whole collection of natural places in the greater Cleveland area, which they are protecting and protection and working with other people. So that this will be part of the future of nature, something that nature that can continue to have a history. So all of this stuff is bubbling and perking, and it's only because people are reaching out to each other that everything is changing and will continue to change. It was MacKaye who said, optimism is oxygen. You get something done and you have more energy to do the next thing.
Yeah, and I think that leads me to the last question for tonight, which is about what we do. And I will be honest with you, one of the most common questions we got when folks registered for this program tonight was, what can I do to affect change? And I think that many people, when they look at the scale of what needs to be done, take a breath and say, wow, what's my role in this? And one of the most optimistic quotes that you have in your book, Tony, is that everyone everywhere, regardless of their skill set, experience, or capacity, is able to do something. And I'm going to be a little bit unfair here and ask you both to kind of suggest to our audience tonight what they can do to be part of this solution that you propose, Tony. And John, maybe if you want to share from your experience what you've
Sure.
done personally in your work to advance this goal to help rescue the planet.
Sure. Tony, you want to go first?
Okay. Well, Google can help. Whatever you think you're interested in, find out who in your area is doing something about it already. There's a wonderful planner up in Maine, Ulla Amundsen. When people ask him that question, he says, who is the Henry David Thoreau of your area? Who is the Andrew Wyeth of your area? Who's thought deeply about the nature and the substance of a place you're in? Who has immersed themselves in that? Find out that's another good way to get started. If you're not already a member of the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, well, here's a chance to remedy that, because who else is going to be able to be in a position to begin to ride herd on all these, so many different kinds of trail-related and landscape-related, realm-related projects, that some of which are already wonderfully in motion and beginning to get cranked up, others of which are still very much in the talking stage. But the more that happens, the more that can happen.
I agree. I would just add that in my experience, a lot of this has to happen at the local level. So individuals can ask themselves if they see destruction of natural assets around them, is there a land trust locally, or do they want to gather with their neighbors and form one? Because most of the states in the watershed provide various, not only funding to land trusts to conserve lands, but other technical assistance. So it's just, I mean, there's lots of these movements around the world that people don't even know about. I was reading Paul Hawkins' book years ago, Blessed Unrest, and that's his point. You can't even count them all, but they're out there and they're doing small things, all of which, as Tony just said, add up to bigger things. So take walks around where you live, see what is either being lost or what could be added to embellish natural assets around you that you can enjoy and sustain your lives. And so much of where we're headed, the conservation movement, in my experience, started off with conserving parcels. It kind of grew into a regional context. And now it's a larger ecosystem context, to wit, we're doing conservation within the ecosystem of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And earlier examples, obviously the Appalachian Trail is a granddaddy, but ones that Tony's talked about elsewhere, Yukon to Yellowstone to Yukon, et cetera. So, but at the bottom line, we've got to connect people and get them more inspired to take individual actions. And there's so many ways you can do that. I think this connection that we're seeing more and more between pandemics and the destruction of nature, particularly forests, and then the transfer of diseases from animals living in those forests to human beings. If that isn't enough to get people, more concerned and motivated to do things constructively, to stop the destruction of forests, to, add to forests. There's still plenty of room left. We've done all these calculations in the Bay watershed. There's still plenty of room left for development, if you will, to meet other societal needs. There is, but it's really been pretty much out of balance, and we got to gradually change it. People have to learn to meet those built environment needs more efficiently, using less land and building in natural spaces, and all those sorts of developments, commercial or residential, whatever. Anyway, I'm kind of running on, but the key is, and that's why local organizations, land trusts, nonprofits, working in watersheds, working in service areas are so critical, because they're the closest to the people that we want to motivate.
Yeah, that echoes the lesson I learned after I read Tony's book. You know, I'm constantly reminded that one of the key things that people can do is find the community that shares one thing in common, which is that they do want to see the planet persist and they do want to be part of the community that rescues the planet. So I think of the Appalachian Trail Conservancy as one of those communities, one amongst many, but we're in this important work too, and we think it matters, and we are taking up the urgent call to action. And more than that, I think that I want to express my gratitude to the both of you for being part of this community and for joining up with us tonight and with our constituents to have this important conversation around the future of the planet. Tony, I also want to just express my deepest gratitude to you for telling the story behind the work that has been done, that is being done, and that will be done for sure in the future to rescue our planet. I don't think a more apt title exists for any book that tackles the topic that you did. So I want to just thank you for doing the work of telling that story. And I recommend to anyone listening tonight and to anyone who is part of a community that wants to rescue the planet to recommend this book to everyone that you know that may be interested. I accessed another book after I read yours, which was my own Appalachian Trail Through Hiker Journal. I was one of the few that actually was pretty loyal to keeping a diary while I was hiking the trail. And I was reminded, kind of the story you told about Benton MacKaye hiking up Stratton Mountain in 1900 was kind of a Madeline moment for me, because it caused me to go root around deep in my closet to pull up exactly what kind of experience I had when I was hiking up the mountains on the AT. And I was reminded of a night in mid-July. It was very cold in Maine. It was in 2015. And I was getting closer and closer to Katahdin. But we were up on the Bigelow Range, and we were staying in Avery Cole campsite. And I remember before we went to sleep, my hiking partner and I ended up setting our alarms for 2 a.m. And that's a crazy thing to do when you're tired after a long day of hiking. But the whole motivation was that we wanted to scramble up to the top of Avery Peak to catch the sunrise over Flagstaff Lake, which many people told us was an excellent idea in theory, but in practice, having to wake up at 2 a.m. is a tough call. But, you know, when we did wake up at 2 a.m., when we hiked that, I don't know, I think it's 0.2 miles to get up from the campsite to the peak, you know, there's a particular show that's put on when you're up on top, and it starts with the sun, which is a sliver on the horizon. It starts to unveil the mountain range ahead. You start to see the lake, and then you start to see the rock scramble on top of the peak. And it's as if Mother Nature is telling you, hey, go ahead, take a long, slow look at everything that matters, because this is your opportunity to do just that. And that moment led to 2 additional through hikes. I hiked the Pacific Crest Trail in 2016. I hiked the Continental Divide Trail in 2017. And it occurred to me when I was reading your book that I have walked across the spine of the East Coast, walked across the spine of the Rockies, and walked across the spine of the West. And that is a privileged thing to do, because from those vantage points, I saw landscapes. That's all you see. You see landscapes. And when I read your book, I was reminded that in these landscapes, what we're seeing is very particular. You know, we're seeing what must be retained, we see what must be restored, and we see what must be reconnected, the 3 R's that you so famously talk about at the end of your book. So years later, being in this position of having this discussion and being part of a conservancy, and more importantly, a community that believes in doing just this, I see this as nothing more than urgent, important, necessary, and in some ways challenging, but also optimistic work to be done. So I want to thank you both again.
Thank you, Shalom. Here's a new goal for you. Hike end to end all the trails of the East.
I don't know. That might be tougher than Half Earth. I don't know.
You look pretty young and vigorous to us.
Well, I don't know if I can say it more, but I want to just thank you both for all the work that you do and for joining us tonight. And I want to also thank everyone who's listening for the support that you've given to this work, to the Conservancy, and to just all that goes into rescuing the planet. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shalom. A treat to be with you.
You too.
Yes, Jones Mitchell. Thank you.